Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I was preparing for this class. I thought it would be a great opportunity to kind of check out my new city, and I found a local antique shop where I was able to find so many really cool vintage postcards that we're going to be talking about today. I loved finding the ones that were already written on by the sender, and some of the stamps on these postcards are from the early 1900s. Obviously, some modern day ones as well. So we're going to be able to compare some vintage postcards to some modern day postcards and just get a sense of what's changed in history since the late 1800s when they were first introduced. The handwriting is what makes them so unique because handwriting is unique to each and every one of us. And postcards are kind of like that too. They're like these little treasure capsules that really they capture this moment in time or a memory or a place. And so I want to dive into our first class in a two-part series all about reviving the lost art of postcard writing. In part one today, I thought it'd be really fun to kind of start with a little lesson on the history and significance of postcards and kind of why they're so worthy, I think, of bringing them back into your repertoire if it's not something you're already doing. In terms of writing instruments, this is totally a personal choice, but it's also a choice based on the paper that you're using for your workbook and the paper of your postcards. I think it'll be best just for you to have a few different options on hand. I will give you some recommendations. The safest bet for stationery as a whole is a ballpoint. So I'm going to be using our Origins collection, Meisterstück ballpoint, which I'm very excited about. I just love the resin look to it, and this has been my go-to, I would say, for even my daily journaling practice lately. And then I also have my favorite, you probably see this in almost all classes that I teach, the Around the World in 80 Days Rollerball. Again, we're going to have to pick and choose where we're using our roller balls, where we're using our ballpoints. And then, of course, I know we are all fountain pen lovers here. And so we are going to have a little chat about when to use a fountain pen. And typically that, blanket statement, you never want to use a fountain pen on a glossier paper. And in modern day times, some postcards tend to have a bit of a sheen or a gloss to them. So again, hang tight. We will get to all of that. So let's get started on page 5. So I want to start with a conversation and the definition of the word deltiologies. It's the study and hobby of collecting postcards. And it's actually the third most common hobby in the world behind collecting money and collecting stamps. For those of us who aren't deltiologists, you might be wondering why postcards can be such a fun and useful way of, commemorating a place, remembering the art, things like that. So I kind of always associated postcards with commemorating a place, like, the big letters across a postcard on the back saying, wish you were here. And it was a picture of the state or the province or the country that you were visiting. And that's certainly, of course, still a major reason why people send postcards, because they want to mark their travel and send a message back home. But there's also postcard collecting without the intention of sending it in the mail. So you're just keeping the postcard as a memory or to commemorate the place that you've been. When we went to Costa Rica for my honeymoon, I came across a shop run by a local artist, and I ended up buying a pack of 10 of her local postcards, not to send them back home, but to keep them. You can see they're still in the original packaging. I have no intention of actually writing on them, although I recently got the idea that maybe I'll just write on the back with the memory of that specific place. But they all kind of represented all of the places and the landmarks that we visited on our honeymoon, but in a really unique and artistic way, which as an artist myself, that really resonated with me. The reason why people send and collect postcards is because they are personal. So personal and meaningful. And so the original intent was for a postcard to be concise and in the moment. So it was not, this really long letter. It was a really short, bite-sized moment in time. So concise plus in the moment. So I want to just give you a couple of examples that I picked up from the vintage postcards, because again, we're talking about the original intent, which is that a postcard is meant to be concise and in the moment. And this was just a really good example from one of the vintage postcards that I found. It says, "Hello, everyone. This is Monday morning. We got to Uncle Charlie's Saturday afternoon at 4:30. went to the movies Saturday night, to church Sunday morning, and took a drive into Quebec in the afternoon. Hope you are fine. We are lonesome for you all. Love, Mother. And I just think that's a perfect example of what the original intent of a postcard is. Just sort of this concise, in the moment, not overly wordy example here. The next one. But this postcard is saying that this is a view of a tea garden. There's plenty of rain at present, and there are so many babies. That's all this postcard says. This was a really fun part. I am just so excited to talk about this brief history here. So we're going to talk about when postcards came to be, and then where we are now in modern day with them. And of course, the idea for postcards could have circulated elsewhere in the world before this, but the agreed upon official inception of postcards was in 1865 by a German postal official who proposed the idea of a correspondence card. So if you want, as I'm talking, you can kind of just jot notes. Again, the notes in your workbook are meant to be for information retention, because when you write it down, it's proven that you're more likely to retain that information. So write down, for this one, I would write down correspondence card. So I'm just going to put a little note up here and put correspondence card. Again, chicken scratch, correspondence card. And it was essentially a brief message without an envelope. That was the idea for the original postcard. But that idea was actually rejected in 1865. And it was in 1869 when Austria-Hungary introduced the world's first official postcard. From there, the idea spread all over Europe, and it still didn't look or function the way our modern-day postcards do, but it eventually made its way to North America. And at first, the postal regulations only permitted the name and address of the recipient on the back. So often what would happen when you only permit the name and address on the back is that the front or the illustrated side would get defaced. And so if you were wondering, when I was showing this example, why somebody had written on the front, it was because this was before the Golden Age, before the regulations were changed, because originally there was no divided back. So as you can see, the divided back period began after 1907. So in this in-between period, the back was just for the name and address. And people would, if they wanted to write a message, would have to deface the actual image itself. So in 1907, the beginning of the Golden Age of Postcards, the divided era began. And that was when they split the back, where instead of just an address, you now had the right side that is for the address, and it was split down the middle, and the correspondence can go on the left side, which meant that nobody had to write on the front of the postcard anymore. So if you look at this early example, before the divided area, that was the back, and then this was almost immediately after, post 1907, and you have the divided back here. And some of them, like even in the early days of the divided back, they all kind of had a different look to them. But it's pretty interesting that no matter where you got a postcard in the world after that period, I found that one quite different and interesting. The divided back was now standard across all postcards. As soon as you had the divided back and there was actually room for correspondence, it was this really new and really incredibly inexpensive way and really convenient way for people to capture other people, places, and events, and keep in touch with friends and relatives when they were traveling without writing these really long, extensive letters. And that's, I think, where it gets interesting. The literary critics were against them because they believed that the fine art of letter writing was going to be threatened with extinction. So as a way, as I said, to get us into modern day, let's talk about what different types of paper they were printed on then compared to now, and what writing instruments are sort of best suited to the coating and the finishes and the quality of the paper. So ever since the early 20th century, during the Golden Age of Postcards up until now, postcards have been printed on this really thick cardstock that's made to withstand mailing without an envelope. They had this matte finish, which really held up nicely to ink and pencil. A lot of people actually in the early days of postcard writing would write in just pencil. A later development was the glossy finish. So a little bit more modern day is that glossy finish. And I'm sure as I was moving that around, see that reflection there? So the front of this postcard has a glossy finish, which is how you know that it is a modern day postcard, because that is a modern printing process. What you want to look for in terms of postcards. So again, thick. All right, in all caps now, thick cardstock. And then not glossy on the back. So it's okay if it's glossy on the front because that'll give you those beautiful, vibrant photography colors. Even in modern times, it's still really important that postcards are printed on thick cardstock. Ideally, again, with the correspondence side and a matte finish. So I'll just write that word too, matte finish. And these are all things, if you're looking at starting to write postcards, these are things that you could ask the shop that you're visiting or terms that you can use to search online. In modern day, postcards can be printed on all kinds of different materials. So this is still thick quality cardstock. It's not glossy. It does have a matte finish, but it's printed on textured paper. So I don't know if you can see that through my camera here, but this is a textured paper. So that you can do linen or felt. And those are two types that I really like. So I'll just write those down for you. Linen, felt. Or you could do recycled. That's actually one of my favorites. I got our wedding invitation postcards printed on recycled paper. It has a similar, I would say, feel to something like a linen or a felt, but it's a little bit smoother. And then there's also synthetic paper. So synthetic paper, which can be really durable. So I'll put that in brackets. It can be really durable when you're using synthetic paper, but it can also be waterproof. So if you're really concerned about sending something in the mail and it getting sort of soggy wet, then you could also look for synthetic paper as well. So in terms of pen and inks to use, I would recommend, as I said, ballpoints. And then I would use your fountain pens for that last batch of papers that we just talked about. So if it is matte and thick, and it's not glossy, and I would recommend using your fountain pen. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, unfortunately, but I would say the gold standard for most stationery would be a ballpoint, and that is because you don't want your ink to smear or not dry on something that is a glossier surface. We know that through the Golden Age, even though the Golden Age of Postcards is over, it's still the third largest collecting hobby in the world. And a lot of that has to do with postcards evolving from a medium of convenient communication. So I would say during sort of this period here, they were all about convenient communication. And now we are getting a little bit more into modern day. So I'll put an arrow up here. And we're moving into postcards being a form of visual expression. Visual expression, which as an artist, as you can imagine, this really interests me as well. Postcards started off very focused on, travel and tourism. And of course, that still dominates the postcard world today. We now are covering everything from, very famous landmarks to artwork as an example. So this particular postcard says, it's a collection of baskets made by Pima Indians in Arizona. I was specifically looking for them. Like, this is a holiday postcard where you could write a holiday greeting on the back. What's interesting about the tourism postcards is that they started to add on the back descriptions of the image that was printed on the front. So instead of having to spend your whole time explaining what the Statue of Liberty was like, as an example, the postcards would actually have a brief description written in the top left corner. I've already written down some different topics here for you, but we're just going to add a few more. So obviously just artwork. We've talked about a few examples of that. Holiday greetings, invitations. I mentioned that we sent out our save the date for our wedding as a postcard. Just kind of eliminates the need for an envelope. And I just really love postcards. So that was relevant to kind of my personality as well. Postcards were even used by companies like hotels and tourism for advertising. So, small towns and even big cities would use postcards as a way to advertise the offerings in their small town or their city. But breaking news was another one because I mentioned it was faster to create a postcard. Daily life was another big one. So there was a ton of postcards just featuring people doing their daily tasks, whether it was putting out laundry on a line or a postcard featuring mechanics at work or an artist in their studio. It was sort of just these little pictures of daily life that you could send all the way around the world. Another one is comics and humor. And then a really interesting one took place in the 1960s, ever since the divided era, which, as we talked about, was the golden age of postcards after 1907. There was this very clear way of composing and mailing postcards no matter where you are in the world. So there's also a standard size of postcards no matter where you are in the world. It's not that they all have to be this size, but the most common size for a postcard worldwide ever since the 1960s is size 4x6. Prior to the 1960s, you had a lot more in the 4.25 by 5.5 inch category. And so that would be, if you look at this as a modern day postcard, this is a postcard from during the Golden Age. It's not that far off, but yeah, just an interesting fact. And then in terms of the back, I think we've already kind of covered this. We won't go into too much detail, but the right side is always for the address and your postage, and the left side is just for the correspondence. And so you never want to switch up the order of those things. You always want the correspondence on the left and the address on the right. And in the early days of postcards, they actually would have to put that directly on there. So on the left, it says for correspondence, and on the right, it says for address only, because this was a new idea. And they would also box out the space for the stamp so that people weren't, putting it in various different points. And then the front is always supposed to be reserved just for the artwork or the photo or the illustration. And depending on the size and weight of your postcard, you might actually need more than one stamp as well. So you want to make sure, that it's on thick cardstock, that your correspondence is on the left, your address is on the right, that you know how many stamps that you should be putting on. And then in terms of the actual address itself, you want to make sure that's super legible. When I used to create wedding invitations, that was a big topic of conversation, is everybody likes the beautiful ornate scripts, but they also have to be very legible, of course, in order for them to make it to their destination and be read by the postal workers. So something, I guess, even it's almost like it's a way for you to take some of that pressure off and just say, I want this to be super legible. Maybe I'm just going to use my cursive writing or my printing, or make sure that my script writing is very, very legible so that it gets to its intended destination. Mail art or correspondence art kicked off in the 1960s as a way for artists to share their work outside of the usual gallery scene. But it was started by someone called Ray Johnson by sending postcards and collages through the mail. And it turned into this global thing where other artists exchanged art with each other just for fun. There was no selling, there was no fame associated to doing this. It was just about making art and sending it through the mail. And anyone can still be involved. There was actually a really huge resurgence of mail art during the pandemic years, but the actual mailing process is what becomes part of the art. So let me find one of those older ones that has a stamp already on it and the markings. Like, see the markings here and the stamp that has the date on it, says it's from 1910. These markings and the stamp itself become a part of the artwork itself. So at its core, it's still the original intent of sending postcards, which is that they're personal and meaningful, but it's bringing art into this space as well. And so maybe instead of, a photograph or a representation of a destination, the front of the postcard becomes a piece of art, and then the back also becomes a piece of art as well, including the sender destination and the little message that the artist might write to one another. I hope that's the same for you and that you're feeling inspired, and I will see you again live next month. So thank you, everyone.